Hello, I'm Fenella Cannell. I'm a reader in social anthropology at the London School of Economics. And I'm asked by the organisers of today's event to suggest some thoughts on the value of the humanities from the perspective of the social sciences. So I should therefore begin, I think, by saying that I don't myself believe that there is any real division between these two fields at all. I'm an anthropologist. I'm not here to talk about my own work today, but I actually specialise in work on religion in Southeast Asia and in North America. But I only am an anthropologist because I previously was a historian. I was first trained here in Cambridge, actually, and was very much influenced by some of the demographic work to which our earlier speakers referred. I think the commitment to empirical understanding at a particular time and place, for me, unites history and anthropology. But I chose anthropology simply because it allows you to do, as it were, social history with people who can still answer back. You can go back and ask them another question if you're not quite sure what they said the first time, which for me is an advantage. Now, anthropology is a discipline that reaches out in many directions, to social geography, to linguistics, to theology, to demography, as well as sometimes to the natural sciences. But I can't imagine being the anthropologist I am without reading history. And the same is true for very many of my colleagues in my own department. I think of Mukhalika Banerjee, for example, who's worked on a very much neglected civil disobedience movement among the Pathans of Pakistan. At the same time, many of the historians and classicists whose work I read and teach have obviously been influenced by anthropology's particular comparative approach. So all the arts and humanities and social science subjects have in common a comparative imagination. In committing oneself to understand another place, time, or literary work, one acquires the knowledge that circumstances and the concepts of the here and now are not the only inevitable or natural state of being. Anthropology extends that commitment to the attempt to describe the lives of ordinary people, from whom otherwise we don't hear so much in the academy, people in the global south, if you like. This requires a continual process of reflection on dominant analytic concepts, as when, for instance, Marilyn Strathern surprised her audience in 1988 by explaining that in Papua New Guinea, one could not rightly describe social interaction in terms of individuals, gender, exchange, work, reproduction, nature, or culture, as those terms are casually deployed in Western discourse. But this radical comparativism is really only one strand of the self-critical imagination and scholarship deployed by historians, philosophers, and many others, including all those interested in the analysis and critique of Western modern experience associated with Marx, Durkheim, for me, Mauss, and with Weber, perhaps the most historically minded of all the foundational sociologists. Now, almost 100 years ago today, in 1918, just before his sudden early death, in fact, Max Weber delivered a lecture at the University of Munich, known now in English as Science as a Vocation. Weber was a complex man, pulled both towards intellectual and towards public life, and this is a dark and a complex lecture. It opens with a caustic comparison of German and American university systems of his time, which leads Weber to the conclusion that if any educational institution succeeds in promoting real scholarship, it will be as much by luck as by judgment. Weber was also not an optimist about modernity. According to his biographers, when asked why he undertook his research into contemporary society, he replied, "To see how much I can bear." Despite... That's a good point, I think. Despite recognising the great advances of contemporary rational science, he was conflicted about the status of scholarship in our times. In Science as a Vocation, he makes an almost despairing list of the claims which learning, here under the label of science to distinguish it, I think, from the creative arts, can no longer make. Science can no longer claim to give us access to the nature of true being, point the way to happiness or to the nature of God. The technical and practical possibilities which knowledge can unlock are certainly useful, he says, but ultimately they are trivial, since the technique of mastering life, which rests on science, as the way to happiness, who believes in this, aside from a few big children? It is part of Weber's point that in modern life, different spheres of existence have become irreversibly separated from each other. Life has lost its historical plasticity, and man is forced to divide himself between different and increasingly irreconcilable values. As intellectual life demands, in Weber's view, an unflinching empiricism, rigorous comparativism, and self-denying objectivity, which, among other things, banishes political interest absolutely from the classroom. But science in the modern world can tell us nothing about what life is for. It cannot provide its meaning or direct its central and ethical goals. Weber indeed takes from Tolstoy a profound engagement with the specific ways in which the preoccupation with progress makes it almost impossible to lead life or confront death in a way which feels meaningful. This is heightened by the banalization of experience which comes from purely material understandings of the world, and by the difficulty, in his view, of taking sincere comfort in traditional religions when they have come to occupy an impossibly oppositional space of irrational belief in confrontation with modern rational science. Weber ends by thinking of the vocation itself as one of the only possible ethical spaces in modern life. There is no point in pursuing knowledge without that vocation, he says, for nothing is worthy of a man unless he can pursue it with passionate devotion. What is to be pursued passionately, however, is disinterested searches for understanding, whose objectives can be at best to gain clarity, including about the relationship between ends and means, for example, in political life. What happens to Weber's advice that politics does not belong in academic life, however, in cases where policy directions themselves appear to call into question the academic commitment to independence of judgment, which Weber found so essential? Peter Mandler and others have recently drawn our attention to the apparent disposal by the current government of one of the most important elements underwriting academic freedom in the UK, the so-called Haldane Principle. Established in the same year that Weber delivered Science as a Vocation, this asserts the idea that the merit of academic projects submitted to funding, for example through research councils, should be judged by other academics. Instead, in both the AHLC and ESLC strategic statements, we see this principle effectively sidelined by the cancellation of the main schemes under which individuals compete for funding on topics of their own choosing. Instead, increasing proportions of these funds are to be available only for research priority areas effectively chosen by the current administration. In the case of the ESLC, I'm happy to report that these areas are economic performance, sustainability and growth, influencing behaviour and informing interventions, and a fair and vibrant society. Obviously, academics will hope and will attempt to create worthwhile projects under these rubrics, but it must be acknowledged that the capacity to do so will be serendipitous, and many avenues of exploration are excluded from these priority definitions. In this context, one might wish to argue that government had fundamentally misunderstood in what sense academic life has a duty to the public, as it most certainly does have. That duty is surely not to pursue the policies of this or any other particular administration through research, but to attempt to understand the truth of the subjects of its research and to communicate that truth as best it can. Without such process, every comparative perspective on the present order of thinking, which comes from the humanities or social sciences, will be truncated, and every set of imagination from which future perspectives may emerge may become impossible. Thank you very much.